Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world one book at a time. For this deep dive, we are tackling a foundational question that seems deceptively simple on the surface. What is the true nature of nonviolence?
Right.
And maybe more importantly, how can it function as an aggressive, transformative force when we, as people, as societies, are already sort of immersed in this fundamental force field of violence?
It's a critical question to ask right now. I mean, the whole public debate around violence is just so unstable.
Completely.
We see states and institutions, constantly twisting definitions. They label legitimate political dissent assemblies, strikes, protests, they just call it all violent.
And it's a tactic, right? It's to justify their own use of force.
It's a tactic to justify their own overwhelming use of coercive force. And this process of flipping the meaning of words, this semantic inversion, it's incredibly dangerous.
Exactly. So what we need and what we're trying to build today is a rigorous vocabulary to track these inversions, to see what they're really for.
Yeah.
Our mission today is a systems analysis. We're drawing heavily on Judith Butler's work to understand why these things keep happening, the suppression of dissent, the fact that some people are just so much more vulnerable than others.
And we're going to get into some deep mechanisms, power structures, of course, but also things like demographic assumptions and even these unconscious scenes that Butler calls phantasms.
Right. These phantasms that literally shape how we perceive violence, who we see as violent, and how it gets distributed in society.
And just to be clear, we're not here to assign blame. This isn't about pointing fingers.
No.
It's about looking at the mechanics of the system that produces these outcomes.
Yeah.
This is not a partisan argument for or against violence. It's more like an intellectual toolkit.
A toolkit to help you, the listener, understand the deep infrastructure, the hidden rules of justification that underpins so much conflict today. So the anchor text for this whole exploration is Judith Butler's 2020 book, The Force of Nonviolence, an ethico-political bind. And for anyone who might not be familiar, Butler is, one of the most influential contemporary philosophers out there. They've spent decades challenging our fixed ideas about gender, identity, and political precarity.
And especially how certain lives are just rendered marginal or even dispensable.
Right. And this book, it really arrived at a critical moment. It speaks directly to this ongoing, persistent skepticism about nonviolence.
A skepticism you hear from all over the political spectrum, too. It's not just one side. On one hand, you have people who say nonviolence is just politically naive, it's passive.
The turn the other cheek idea that doesn't work in the real world.
Exactly. And then, and this is a really important critique, there's an argument from parts of the left that violence is actually a necessary tactic for radical change.
Because marginalized people are already living under a state of systemic violence.
Precisely. The logic is, if violence is already happening to you constantly, why shouldn't you use it as a tool to fight back?
And Butler takes that critique seriously, but also pairs it with this external threat, the state's misuse of the term violence.
Yes. The book was written in part as a response to governments just maligning these huge, popular, and mostly nonviolent movements.
We saw it with Black Lives Matter, which was so often painted as inherently destructive.
Or the Gezi Park protests in Istanbul, which
Right.
were branded as this massive security threat. Even, peace petitions signed by Turkish academics were reframed as acts of aggression against the state.
It's this incredible power the state has, the ability to call nonviolence violence and its own violence necessary law.
And that operation is the key, the defining political move of our time. So Butler is trying to reclaim nonviolence from this double dismissal, from being seen as passive on one side and from being a semantic target for state suppression on the other.
Okay, so if nonviolence is so easily dismissed as just a passive individual choice, what's Butler's central argument? What is this force she's describing?
Well, in the simplest terms, Butler argues that we've profoundly misunderstood nonviolence if we only see it as an individual, a moral choice to just refrain from doing something.
So it's not about what I personally choose not to do.
No. She posits an aggressive, collective form of nonviolence. And it's rooted in something much deeper than personal choice. It's rooted in acknowledging our deep, unavoidable social interdependency.
Our shared fate, in a way. And that acknowledgement has to lead to a political demand, right? It's not just an observation.
Absolutely. The practice of aggressive nonviolence is tied directly to a radical political demand for equality.
And how is that equality achieved?
primarily through exposing and opposing the systems that regulate the grievability of lives, and grievability is the central concept in the book.
Let's define that. What is grievability?
It's the measure of whose life is considered worth protecting while they're alive, and whose loss is worth mourning when they die. Nonviolence then has to be a direct confrontation with the structures that declare some lives ungrievable and therefore, functionally disposable.
Let's start with that central challenge then, this idea of aggressive nonviolence. It sounds like a contradiction in terms to most people.
It really does.
When we think nonviolence, we think quiet, moral resolve, a personal choice to not act violently. But Butler says that definition just isn't enough.
It's not enough because that passive individual definition is exactly what the powerful want us to believe. It renders nonviolence politically weak.
It defangs it.
It defangs it, exactly.
Yeah.
For Butler, nonviolence is not just the absence of violence. It's a sustained, active, and aggressively pursued practice of resistance.
And it often emerges right at the moment when violence seems most justified.
That's the crucial point. It emerges precisely when the impulse to respond with violence feels inevitable, when it seems like the only tool left for justice. Nonviolence is the active work of turning that tide.
She connects this to some powerful historical ideas. You mentioned Einstein's militant pacifism and Gandhi's satyagraha, or soul force.
Yes, and it's about rerouting that immense psychological and political energy.
Rerouting is a great word for it.
It is. It's taking these potent internal forces, the rage, the indignation, even the destructive potential we all have, and deliberately channeling it away from destructive aims and toward affirming ideals of equality and freedom.
And critically, she insists that aggression is not the same thing as violence.
Not at all. And nonviolence does not mean the absence of force.
Okay, so if it's not physical violence, how does this nonviolent force show up in the real world, in politics?
It shows up as embodied force. You can look at the whole history of civil disobedience. Think about collective actions like the lunch counter sit-ins in the civil rights movement.
Or protesters linking arms to form a human barrier.
Exactly. Or even the political act of going limp when being arrested. These are not passive retreats. They are physical assertions.
The body itself becomes an obstacle.
The body becomes an obstacle. It exerts a force against force to block or derail the machinery of state violence. At the sit-in, the black body insists on its right to be present in a space designed to exclude it.
It's a claim.
It's a powerful claim. And by going limp, the body, even in its vulnerability, refuses to cooperate with the mechanics of its own suppression. The body, in its radical persistence, just by being there, makes a political demand. It turns vulnerability into a source of power.
So in order to sustain that kind of collective force, Butler argues we have to dismantle our usual starting point, which is the individual. Why does nonviolence have to move beyond this egological ethics, as she calls it?
Because that whole framework where morality is just about the internal choices of a self-sufficient person, that's a luxury. It's a luxury only available to the privileged.
What do you mean by that?
Well, deliberating about nonviolence as if it's some abstract choice, it presumes a self that is separate from the conflict, a self that gets to choose when and how to engage with violence.
Which ignores the fact that for so many people, systemic violence is just the air they breathe. It's already happening.
It's already happening all the time. The very framing of the question is biased towards the powerful. And she traces this back to the core fictions of liberal political theory.
The Robinson Crusoe idea?
The Robinson Crusoe fiction, exactly. Following Marx, she critiques this idea of the human as, a solitary adult man, independent, who then chooses to enter society.
It completely erases our history of dependency. The fact that every single person is born needing constant care.
It annihilates it. We are fundamentally interdependent beings, and that leads to her real foundation for the self.
Which is not the individual, but our relationships.
Interdependency and social bonds. The self is made through complex, often difficult, ambivalent relationships with others. We are creatures of dependency.
And so if that's true, then preserving the self means preserving the social ties that make the self possible.
That's the critical conclusion. Violence done to another person is, in this very deep sense, violence against the self's own social fabric. We are linked, whether we like it or not.
So violence against the other actually diminishes the conditions of your own existence.
It fundamentally compromises your own life because the social ties that sustain you are being broken. It transforms nonviolence from a personal virtue into a political necessity.
A requirement for the social world to even continue.
Right.
So if the self is relational, that brings us to the next logical point. What is the cost when those ties are broken? And whose broken ties do we, as a society, actually mourn? This leads us straight to grievability.
This is the ethico-political ideal at the heart of the book, the demand for the radical equality of the grievable.
And we have to start by acknowledging a pretty brutal fact.
The brutal fact that lives are not equally valued in this world. Because of racism, xenophobia, misogyny, these power structures determine whose life is worth defending and whose loss warrants, global outrage.
Can you give us an example of how that differential plays out?
Sure. I mean, think about the media response when a wealthy tourist goes missing in a Western country.
It's a 24-hour news cycle, international search efforts, moral outrage.
It is. That is a grievable life. Now, compare that to the thousands of migrant workers who die trying to cross a border, or incarcerated people who die in overcrowded prisons.
Their deaths are often just statistics.
Exactly. They are the ungrievable lives. Their destruction leaves, as Butler says, barely a trace. They're cast into what Fanon called the zone of non-being. They're socially dead before they're physically dead.
So the egalitarian demand here is purely structural. It's not just about feeling bad. It requires institutional commitment.
It has to be. A commitment to nonviolence requires this radical equality of the grievable. If every life was regarded as grievable from the start, the entire social world would have to reorganize itself to prevent that loss.
We're talking about robust healthcare, housing, fair labor practices.
All of it. The preservation of life would become a social and political obligation, not just an individual hope. It forces us to imagine a completely different society, one where the destruction of any single life is seen as an intolerable systemic failure.
It's a definition of political responsibility. If a society fails to mourn certain deaths, it's because the system has, in some way, sanctioned those deaths.
Yes. So if the preservation of life is the goal, then we have to critically examine the most common exception to nonviolence: self-defense.
Most people would say self-defense is just inherently justifiable.
Of course. But Butler pushes us to scrutinize the self that is being defended. Who is this self when the trigger is pulled?
And when you look closely, it's rarely just a single person under immediate threat.
It's almost never that simple. More often, the self being defended is an expanded exclusionary regime. It could be a specific family, a community defined by race or class, or a privileged national identity.
It's a defense of one's own sphere of belonging, which is defined by excluding others.
And that selective defense is what kicks off the war logic. The unspoken rule is, I defend those like me, those who I consider grievable, but I sanction the destruction of those who are not like me.
And this distinction is almost always based on deep-seated racial and demographic assumptions.
And what's really crucial here is how little provocation is needed to justify lethal force. This is where the phantasm of threat comes in.
Let's unpack that term, phantasm of threat. It's a bit abstract. How does an unconscious social scene, a phantasm, lead to a very real conscious act of lethal violence?
It's the moral justification machine. A phantasm is a socially shared, often unconscious story that pre-structures how we see the world. So the privileged self doesn't need an actual physical attack from the marginalized other to feel threatened.
Any possible threat is enough. An imagined fear based on racism is enough.
It's more than enough to unleash self-entitled violence. The system has already pre-labeled certain bodies as inherently dangerous.
So the person who is killed doesn't even register as a grievable life. They're seen as pure violence embodied.
Exactly. They are perceived as an imminent threat of destruction. And therefore, the actor, the police officer, the citizen with a gun sees their own lethal action as totally legitimate self-defense.
This is the mechanism for the moralization of murder. The system uses this phantasm to justify the destruction of the ungrievable. It's the defense of power, disguised as the defense of life.
It's terrifyingly effective.
So let's shift to tactical justifications. When people argue for violence for a cause, they often frame it as a necessary tool, a techna, to achieve a nonviolent end. We have to do this ugly thing now to get to the good thing later.
It's the instrumentalist argument. And Butler, following Walter Benjamin, really questions this whole means-ends distinction.
Because violence isn't a neutral tool like a hammer.
It's not. Benjamin argues that violence is a praxis. It's a means that, in its very use, creates its own end.
So the act of using violence actually licenses more violence in the future, no matter what your original intention was.
Precisely. The instrumentalist thinks they can just put the tool down when the job is done. But Butler and Benjamin would say violence is more like an auto-replicating virus. The act of using it activates a, quote, sedimented legacy of destruction in the world. It always exceeds your intention.
How does it exceed the intention?
Well, if you set up a violent revolutionary cell as a temporary tool, The whole organizational logic, the culture you need to sustain that violence, it becomes permanent. The means, the capacity for organized destruction, it posits its own end, which is its own survival.
So it doesn't just stop when the just end is achieved.
It renews and repeats itself in unpredictable ways, through internal purges or new conflicts, or just by contributing to the global justification of arms. The use of violence as a means becomes its own end. The creation of a more violent world.
It's a powerful warning. You can never really control the destructive energy you unleash, even if your goals are pure.
And to understand why that energy is so hard to control, Butler actually turns inward, to psychoanalysis, to Freud and Melanie Klein.
To understand the source of destructiveness itself.
Yes, because they show that conflict and destructive potential are just abiding features of our necessary interdependency.
Which is vital, because if nonviolence is a struggle, it has to know what it's struggling against.
It does. The self is born into this unbearable dependency on others, the mother, the caregiver, and that dependency generates incredible ambivalence. Love and the most destructive hate are born at the same time from that bond.
So conflict is just part of being human.
It is. Nonviolence isn't the absence of this destructive potential. It's the active, sustained work of channeling it away from destruction.
But what happens when that destructive potential turns inward?
This is where Freud's later work on the superego is so important. The superego, our internalized critic, can weaponize aggression against the self. It can become a pure culture of the death drive, leading to this intense, suicidal self-criticism.
We see that in political movements, don't we? The endless purity tests, the internal cannibalism.
Absolutely. So if that's the result of an internalized tyrant, how does the self or the collective break free?
Freud's answer is mania.
Mania. Not in the clinical sense, but as this aggressive, almost delusional, unrealistic desire to exist and persist. It's the psychic force strong enough to break the bond with that internal tyrant.
It's the ego insisting on its right to live against all odds.
Yes. And politically, this translates into those unrealistic forms of insurrectionary solidarity. Mania is a cipher for movements that refuse the status quo, even if their goals seem impossible or divorced from reality.
So aggressive nonviolence channels that necessary force of refusal.
It channels it away from destroying others and toward affirming a collective, livable future. It's the refusal to be destroyed, whether by an external system or an internal one.
Which brings us back full circle to the war of words. The ability to define what counts as violence is a primary instrument of power.
It's everything. The state maintains its monopoly by just renaming its own acts.
Imprisonment, military strikes, border control, that's all framed as legal or necessary force.
It conceals the violence embedded in the state's own functions, and at the same time, they rename any effective resistance as violence.
Right. Strikes become economic sabotage. Protests become riots.
Exactly. So Butler argues the critical task isn't just to come up with our own definition. It's to undertake a critique of the schemes of justification that frame the whole debate.
We can't just define violence. We have to analyze how those definitions are being manipulated by power.
We have to. When a massive protest is instantly labeled a riot before anything has even happened, the goal is to shut down legitimate critique before it starts. It's a way for the state to project its own destructiveness onto its opposition, making them easy targets.
Okay, so let's take these tools, grievability, phantasms, and map them onto the political systems that govern our world, moving from the theory to the actual mechanisms.
Right. The primary actor is, of course, the state. But we have to look at the more subtle form of governance that shapes our lives. Biopower.
The system that manages populations, deciding who gets to live, and, crucially, who is let to die.
And this letting die is rarely a sudden physical act. It's the slow, systemic removal of the scaffolding of life.
It's denying clean water, closing clinics, abandoning communities to environmental disaster.
It's creating detention camps, where lives are imperiled by neglect and exposure. This management of life's value is inherently violent.
And the most destructive mechanism we've identified is the deployment of racial phantasms. How does that unconscious fear operate as a system of control?
It's like the cultural software that structures our perception. Fanon's historic racial schema casts marginalized people, black and brown individuals, migrants, as the vessel of violence itself.
So it creates this systemic paranoia in the privileged group, making them feel like they're under constant siege.
Which then feeds that dangerous inversion of aggression we talked about, the moralization of murder.
Because the lethal action is justified since the target isn't seen as a person, but as pure violence embodied.
Exactly. The police officer's violent act is rationalized, even to themselves, as legitimate self-defense. It's a crucial control mechanism because it lets the system commit violence while feeling totally pure and defensive. The phantasm makes the violence invisible to the actor.
So what are the deep incentives driving this whole system?
The primary incentive is the preservation of power, the preservation of existing social and economic inequalities. The system rewards people who adhere to this schema of differential grievability.
If you accept that some lives are disposable, you preserve your own status within the privileged group.
It's structural self-preservation at the cost of the other. And the outcome, of course, is the creation of these vast, ungrievable populations.
People who are exposed to destruction in all these layered ways, institutional, economic, legal, environmental.
We have to see that denying unemployment benefits or housing assistance is just as much a form of violence as a physical blow, because it actively imperils life.
But why does the system persist, even when the outcomes are so damaging for society as a whole?
It persists because the justifications, the laws, the media narratives reproduce their own legitimacy. But psychologically, it relies on projection,
The privileged group projects its own destructive potential onto the external other.
which externalizes all guilt. It prevents the dominant culture from ever needing to look in the mirror. The system survives by making the victim bear the burden of the aggressor's own conscience.
And the system is held together by these self-reinforcing cycles. Let's trace the first one, the self-preservation loop, the war logic.
So this loop starts when the privileged self, say a nation-state, identifies with its regime and expels difference.
Step 2. That difference is immediately imagined as an existential threat. If those refugees arrive, they will destroy our culture.
That phantasm of destruction then licenses defensive violence, border walls, detention, deportation.
Which in turn reinforces the original nationalist regime because its identity depends on having an external enemy.
The loop makes war logic feel eternally necessary and justified.
The second loop is the impunity loop, and it uses the example of feminicidio, gender-motivated killing.
This is a powerful illustration of how systemic failure actively reinforces violence. The violence is committed.
Then the legal and police structures fail to prosecute, or they dismiss the crime, or they blame the victim.
Right. This active refusal to recognize the crime as such builds impunity directly into the social structure. And because the state sanctions this non-response, the violence reproduces with greater speed and intensity. It maintains a climate of sexual terror.
So impunity isn't just a consequence. It's the accelerant.
It is. The system signals that certain lives are ungrievable and therefore killable. The message is subordinate or die. And that violence is maintained not just by the attacker, but by the state's failure to recognize and mourn the loss.
So we can connect this framework directly to how populations are governed today. This differential grievability is the practical metric used in border security, policing, you name it.
Look at the global migrant crisis.
Yeah.
When political narratives frame migrants as an existential threat, as a force of destruction.
They are immediately cast as the aggressors.
Right. And that licenses lethal state violence. Mass detention, abandonment, the policy of letting die we see in the Mediterranean, the system's paranoid version of self-defense authorizes the destruction of an entire population.
And domestically, we see this so clearly in policing.
The disproportionate killing of unarmed Black and brown people, defended as self-defense, is the most visible demonstration of that historic racial schema in action.
The person killed simply doesn't register as a grievable life worth preserving.
The act is a convergence of biopolitical logic, who is disposable, and that phantasmagoric inversion where the officer perceives an ultimate threat even when the target is unarmed or restrained.
I mean, the specific horror of an example like George Floyd is that he visibly announced he couldn't breathe, and the system's logic still declared that his life just didn't matter in that moment.
Exactly. The body is already classified as ungrievable, so the force used against it isn't registered as murder by the system designed to protect the privileged self.
And this has to connect to lived experience. The terror faced by women, addressed by movements like Ni Una Menos.
This is systemic terror at an intimate level. It's not isolated pathology, it's domination maintained by that impunity loop. When the legal system refuses to prosecute, it creates a social architecture where women and feminized people know they are killable.
The threat of annihilation is the control mechanism.
And vulnerability extends beyond just physical threat to the very infrastructure that sustains life.
Right. Dependency isn't just psychological, it requires infrastructure. Food, housing, clean water.
So when that infrastructure is imperiled, life itself is being attacked by kind of slow administrative violence. Nonviolence, therefore, has to be a political principle that actively safeguards the conditions of livability for everyone.
So if the status quo is so deeply rooted in these violent justifications, how does aggressive nonviolent resistance even break through?
It requires what Butler calls a certain leave-taking from reality as it is currently constituted, a counter-realism.
It has to insist on a future that the current system says is impossible.
And it does that using nonviolent acts to assert existence.
Yeah.
Think of the Turkish standing man from the Gezi Park protests.
Where the state had banned assembly and he just stood there.
He stood alone, perfectly compliant, silent. He performed perfect submission. And then hundreds followed. They displayed the ban itself. Their nonviolent persistence made an invisible injustice visible.
Or the refugees who stitched their mouths shut.
A dramatic display of voicelessness. They showed physically that their demand could not be voiced. They displayed their political limits to force a demand onto the global stage. These are radical forms of persistence in a state of extreme vulnerability. That is the force of nonviolence.
This whole deep dive really provides a foundational shift away from individual blame.
It has to. What looks like an isolated act of violence, blaming a specific person's morality, is actually a punctual moment within a reiterated practice of violence, enabled by these huge systemic schemas.
So by reframing the problem around our social interdependency, nonviolence becomes a political task of world building. It's not just about individual conscience.
It's about altering the structures of grievability. The system is the root cause. The individual act is the symptom.
And we often think of law as this neutral process for resolving conflict, but Butler, following Benjamin, just dismantles that.
Law is deeply violent. It institutes its own violence, the state's coercion, its Gewalt. And the state's ability to rename its own violence as law is a hidden mechanism of power to suppress critique.
It's the mechanism that lets the system judge its own violent outcomes as legitimate.
Exactly. And finally, this means the whole moral debate about exceptions like self-defense is just completely compromised from the start.
Because the principle isn't applied universally. It's already framed by a prejudice about whose life is worth defending.
It is. It reveals how our supposedly universal moral principles are actually in the sway of other political interests. They give a moral justification for social hierarchy. So the struggle for nonviolence has to start by dismantling the unequal grievability that corrupts our moral language in the first place.
So the force of nonviolence really forces us to reconsider the entire political landscape. It reframes nonviolence from a passive moral retreat into an aggressive ethico-political struggle.
A struggle to preserve the conditions of livability for all. It demands we analyze the language of power, the fiction of the individual, and the brutal mechanisms of grievability that underpin global inequality.
And this perspective matters because nonviolence, rooted in that recognition of our interdependency, becomes this ongoing obligation to subdue destruction and affirm the equal worth of life.
It's a collective task of maintenance and repair.
And it requires an egalitarian imaginary, a way to challenge what we currently accept as realistic and fight for a future where all lives are structurally safeguarded.
And this leaves us with one final, provocative question from Butler. If destructive potential love and hate is an abiding feature of being human, how do we sustain this struggle?
How do we live with conflict without immediately converting it into destruction?
And her answer is that we don't have to love one another to engage in this kind of solidarity. Nonviolence becomes the desire for the other's desire to live. It's a way of saying, in the face of all this, you are grievable, the loss of you is intolerable, and I want you to live.
That brings us to the end of our deep dive into Judith Butler's The Force of Nonviolence, an ethico-political bind. We encourage you to read the book yourself, support the author if you found these ideas valuable, or check your local library for free access. For a shorter, visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description. If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.